Sometimes the most dangerous mistake is judging a stranger before learning his name. The flashing blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror just as the morning sun climbed above the skyline of Birmingham, Alabama. Traffic moved steadily along the six-lane boulevard, commuters heading toward office buildings, schools, and government offices as another ordinary weekday quietly unfolded. A dark gray luxury sedan eased into the right lane and came to a smooth stop along the shoulder without hesitation. Behind the wheel sat Elijah Brooks, a 63-year-old black man dressed in a tailored navy suit with a crisp white shirt and a conservative blue tie. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his calm expression never changed as he shifted the vehicle into park, turned off the engine, and rested both hands on the steering wheel where they remained clearly visible. There was no sign of panic, no frustration, no attempt to question why he had been stopped. He simply waited. A white patrol vehicle rolled to a stop several yards behind him, its emergency lights reflecting across the polished surface of the sedan. Officer Ryan Carter stepped out, adjusted the camera attached to the center of his uniform, and walked toward the driver's side with measured confidence. Years in law enforcement had taught him to trust his instincts above everything else, and this morning those instincts had already convinced him that something about the driver did not belong. Before reaching the window, Ryan briefly glanced across the interior of the vehicle, scanning every visible detail with quiet suspicion. The cabin was spotless. A leather briefcase rested on the rear seat beside several neatly organized folders. Nothing appeared unusual, yet his expression remained guarded. Elijah lowered the driver's window with a calm movement and greeted the officer politely. "Good morning, officer." His voice was steady, respectful, and completely free of irritation. Ryan barely acknowledged the greeting before asking for the driver's license and vehicle registration. Elijah nodded without argument. "Certainly." He reached slowly toward the center console exactly as instructed, careful to make every movement deliberate and visible. Even then, Ryan's eyes followed each motion with unwavering attention. Passing motorists slowed as they drove by, some glancing toward the traffic stop before continuing on their way. A delivery truck rumbled past, followed by a city bus carrying dozens of passengers whose faces briefly turned toward the flashing lights. To everyone watching it, looked like another routine roadside stop that would be forgotten within minutes. Yet the air carried an unusual stillness that was difficult to explain. Elijah handed over the requested documents with both hands and returned them calmly to the steering wheel. Ryan studied the license for several long seconds before looking back at the driver. Something about Elijah's quiet confidence unsettled him. Most people became nervous during traffic stops. Some talked too much. Others rushed to explain themselves before any question had been asked. This driver did neither. He simply waited with remarkable patience, as though he had no need to prove anything to anyone. Ryan looked once more at the name printed on the license, then back at the composed man sitting behind the wheel. He believed he was in complete control of the situation. What he did not realize was that this ordinary morning had already become the beginning of a lesson neither of them would ever forget. Officer Ryan Carter carried Elijah Brooks's driver's license back to the patrol vehicle without saying another word. The morning traffic continued flowing beside the shoulder in an endless rhythm of engines, sunlight, and hurried commuters who had no idea that a single roadside encounter was quietly becoming something far more significant than an ordinary traffic stop. Ryan climbed into his cruiser, entered the license information into the computer terminal, and waited for the system to respond. Everything appeared valid. The registration matched the vehicle. The insurance was current. No warrants. No outstanding violations. Nothing in the report suggested criminal activity. Yet instead of ending the stop, Ryan continued studying the information on the screen as though searching for a reason that had not yet appeared. Something about the driver continued to bother him, although he could not explain exactly what it was. Elijah remained inside the sedan exactly as before. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, his eyes looking straight ahead rather than watching the patrol car through the mirrors. The leather briefcase on the back seat had not moved. Neither had the neatly organized folders beside it. A soft breeze stirred the leaves of nearby oak trees while sunlight reflected across the windshield. Minutes passed without either man speaking. A woman walking her dog along the sidewalk slowed for a moment, glanced toward the flashing patrol lights, then quietly continued on her way. A city maintenance truck rolled past, followed by a school bus filled with children beginning another ordinary day. To every passing driver, the scene looked completely routine. Elijah finally noticed Ryan stepping out of the patrol vehicle again and approaching with the same measured pace. The officer stopped beside the open window and looked carefully at the driver's face before speaking. "Sir, where are you headed this morning?" Elijah answered politely without hesitation. "I have a meeting downtown." His voice remained calm, respectful, and free of frustration. Ryan asked another question. "Business meeting?" Elijah offered a slight smile. "You could say that." The answer was truthful, yet it revealed almost nothing. Ryan frowned slightly, clearly dissatisfied. Most drivers volunteered additional explanations, hoping to shorten the encounter. Elijah did not. He answered every question honestly, but only the question that had actually been asked. There was something unusual about that quiet discipline. It felt practiced rather than accidental. Ryan glanced once more inside the vehicle. Every detail seemed orderly. The suit, the polished shoes, the spotless interior, the careful way the documents had been organized. None of it fit the assumptions that had formed in his mind only minutes earlier, yet instead of reconsidering those assumptions, he searched for another reason to continue. Imagine sitting inside your own car, fully cooperating, speaking respectfully, answering every question, and still sensing that the person standing outside had already reached a conclusion before the conversation even began. Elijah understood that feeling better than most people ever would, but his expression never changed. He simply waited with remarkable patience, allowing the silence to settle naturally between them. Ryan looked once again at the driver's license resting in his hand, then back at the composed man sitting before him. The name on the card meant nothing to him. At least, not yet. And somewhere beneath the quiet morning sky, the distance between assumption and truth was about to become much smaller than either man expected. Officer Ryan Carter took one slow step back from the driver's window, folded Elijah Brooks's license between two fingers, and looked once more through the spotless interior of the sedan. The conversation had given him nothing unusual to work with, yet instead of bringing the stop to a routine conclusion, he pressed forward with another series of questions. "How long have you owned this vehicle?" he asked. Elijah answered without hesitation. "Just over 3 years." "Is it registered in your name?" "Yes, it is." "Are you carrying anything in the vehicle that I should know about?" Elijah offered the same calm expression that had never left his face. "Only business documents and personal belongings." Every answer arrived politely, directly, and without unnecessary explanation. Instead of easing Ryan's concern, the driver's quiet confidence seemed to deepen it. Another patrol vehicle slowly pulled onto the shoulder behind the first cruiser. Officer Melissa Grant stepped out, adjusted her radio, and walked toward Ryan with professional curiosity. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly. Ryan kept his eyes on Elijah while answering. "I am still checking a few things." Melissa glanced briefly toward the sedan. Through the open driver's window, she saw an older gentleman sitting perfectly still, hands resting on the steering wheel, waiting patiently, without complaint. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. Passing traffic continued moving steadily while a few drivers slowed slightly to observe the flashing lights before continuing toward downtown. A local news van drove by without stopping. A cyclist crossed the nearby intersection. The entire city continued its normal rhythm while an invisible tension quietly grew along the roadside. Ryan stepped back to the driver's window again. "Sir, would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Elijah looked at him for a brief moment before answering respectfully. "Officer, may I ask whether there is a specific reason for that request?" His tone remained calm. It carried no challenge, no sarcasm, only a sincere request for clarification. Ryan answered firmly, "It is part of my investigation." Elijah gave a slow nod. "Very well." He carefully informed the officers before every movement, unfastened his seatbelt, opened the door slowly, and stepped onto the shoulder exactly as instructed. His posture remained straight. His suit was perfectly pressed despite the morning heat. He closed the car door gently behind him and stood quietly beside the vehicle with his hands visible. Melissa watched the exchange closely. The driver's cooperation was complete. Every instruction had been followed without hesitation. Even so, Ryan continued studying Elijah with visible suspicion, as though he expected the next few seconds to reveal something hidden beneath the calm exterior. Imagine standing on the side of a busy American roadway while strangers passing by silently create their own story about who you are, even though none of them know your name, your profession, or where you were heading just minutes earlier. Elijah understood that silent judgment, yet he refused to let it disturb his composure. A light breeze carried the sound of traffic across the boulevard as Ryan circled slowly around the sedan, occasionally glancing toward the leather briefcase visible through the rear window. Melissa remained near Elijah, quietly observing both men. She sensed that something about the stop no longer felt routine, although she could not explain why. Meanwhile, Ryan believed he was only moments away from confirming the suspicion that had guided him since the flashing lights first appeared behind the gray sedan. He had no idea that the truth standing patiently beside the vehicle was preparing to challenge every assumption he had made from the very beginning. Officer Melissa Grant quietly stepped closer to Elijah Brooks, maintaining a respectful distance while observing the unusual calm that surrounded him. During hundreds of roadside stops throughout her career, she had seen anxious drivers, frustrated drivers, and frightened drivers. This was different. The man standing beside the gray sedan appeared neither defensive nor impatient. He simply waited with quiet dignity, as though he understood that time would eventually answer questions words could not. Ryan Carter completed another slow walk around the vehicle before stopping near the rear passenger door. Through the window, he could clearly see the leather briefcase resting neatly on the seat beside several organized folders. Everything inside the car looked orderly. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing appeared suspicious. Even so, his expression remained firm. "Sir," Ryan said, "what exactly is inside the briefcase?" Elijah answered with the same measured tone he had used since the beginning of the stop. "Professional documents." Ryan looked unconvinced. "What kind of documents?" Elijah paused briefly before replying. "Documents related to my work." Once again, the answer was truthful without revealing more than the question required. Ryan folded his arms for a moment, clearly expecting additional explanation that never came. A few more vehicles slowed as they passed the flashing patrol lights. Some drivers glanced through open windows before continuing toward the city. A young couple walking along the sidewalk briefly stopped near a bus shelter, quietly watching the interaction from a respectful distance. No one spoke. No one interfered. They simply observed another roadside stop that appeared ordinary on the surface. Melissa studied Elijah carefully. His polished dress shoes remained perfectly aligned beside the curb. His suit jacket rested naturally against his shoulders despite the warm Alabama morning. Even the way he stood reflected years of discipline and composure. There was no restless movement, no visible irritation, no attempt to persuade the officers. Ryan stepped closer once again. "Sir, is there anything else you want to tell me before this investigation continues?" Elijah met the officer's eyes without hesitation. "Only that I appreciate professionalism, officer, and I believe every encounter should begin with fairness." The sentence was delivered so calmly that it almost sounded like ordinary conversation, yet something about those words lingered in the morning air. Melissa noticed Ryan hesitate for the briefest moment before looking away. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Imagine standing beside a busy highway while every passing stranger assumes the flashing lights tell the entire story, even though the truth has not yet spoken a single complete sentence. Elijah understood that appearances often shaped opinions long before facts had the opportunity to arrive. Still, he refused to let assumptions determine his own behavior. He remained courteous because courtesy required no permission. He remained patient because patience cost nothing. Ryan finally glanced once more at the driver's license resting in his hand. The name Elijah Brooks still carried no meaning for him beyond the printed letters on a government-issued card. Yet Melissa quietly noticed something else. Beneath the driver's license, partially visible inside the open wallet resting on the roof of the sedan where Elijah had briefly placed it while following instructions, was another identification holder unlike any ordinary credential she had seen before. She could not read the words from where she stood, but the distinctive seal embossed into the dark leather immediately caught her attention. Before she could say anything, Ryan reached toward the wallet, believing he was about to confirm his suspicions. Neither officer realized they were only seconds away from discovering that the quiet man standing before them held a position that would forever change the meaning of this ordinary morning. Ryan Carter reached toward the wallet resting carefully on the roof of the gray sedan, his attention fixed on the unfamiliar leather credential holder partially visible beneath Elijah Brooks's driver's license. Before touching it, he looked directly at Elijah. "Sir, does this belong to you?" Elijah answered with the same calm voice that had carried through every moment of the encounter. "Yes, officer. It does." Ryan picked up the wallet slowly, opened it just enough to examine the contents, and immediately paused. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as his eyes focused on the embossed seal and the official identification secured inside the holder. For the first time that morning, he stopped speaking. Officer Melissa Grant noticed the silence before she noticed the credential itself. She stepped closer, remaining respectful, and quietly asked, "Ryan, is everything all right?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the identification, then at the composed gentleman standing beside the sedan. Elijah neither smiled nor appeared offended. He simply waited. The morning breeze carried the distant sound of traffic through the intersection, while sunlight reflected across the polished surface of the vehicle. The passing world continued without interruption, completely unaware that an ordinary roadside stop had reached an extraordinary turning point. Ryan cleared his throat before speaking. "Sir, may I ask what your position is?" Elijah looked directly at him with quiet dignity. "I serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court." The words were spoken without pride or drama. They sounded like a simple statement of fact. Melissa's eyes widened as she looked from Elijah to the credential still resting in Ryan's hands. She recognized the official seal immediately. Every detail matched. The identification was authentic. Ryan read the name again, this time much more carefully. Elijah Brooks, Chief Justice. The letters that had seemed ordinary only minutes earlier now carried a meaning he had completely overlooked. For several long seconds, no one moved. Even the passing traffic seemed strangely distant. Imagine discovering that the person you had silently judged from the very first moment was someone who had spent an entire lifetime protecting the very system of justice you believed you represented. That realization settled heavily over the roadside. Yet the greatest surprise was not Elijah's position. It was the way he carried it. There had been countless opportunities to announce his title, to interrupt the questions, or to end the encounter immediately. He had chosen none of them. Instead, he had answered every question respectfully, followed every instruction calmly, and allowed the conversation to unfold exactly as any ordinary citizen might have done. Ryan slowly closed the credential holder with both hands, taking noticeably greater care than before. The certainty that had guided him since the flashing lights first appeared behind the gray sedan had quietly disappeared. In its place stood uncertainty, reflection, and the uncomfortable realization that assumptions could sometimes become the greatest obstacle to fairness. Elijah accepted the wallet back with a polite nod and slipped it carefully inside his suit jacket. He offered no criticism, no lecture, and no demand for special treatment. His composure remained exactly as it had been from the beginning. Melissa looked toward Ryan, sensing that the next decision would matter far more than anything that had happened so far. Standing beneath the clear Alabama sky, with morning traffic continuing only a few yards away, both officers understood that the encounter had become something much larger than a traffic stop. It had become a quiet test of character, and the most important lesson had only just begun. Ryan Carter stood silently for several moments, the morning sounds of Birmingham continuing around him as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Cars passed along the boulevard, traffic lights changed from red to green, and pedestrians continued toward their destinations without realizing that an ordinary roadside stop had quietly become a lesson that would remain with everyone present for years to come. Ryan carefully handed the identification back to Elijah Brooks with both hands. "Sir," he said sincerely, "thank you for your patience." There was no attempt to excuse the assumptions that had shaped the encounter. There was no hurried explanation. His voice simply carried the honesty of someone beginning to understand the weight of fairness. Elijah accepted the credential with a respectful nod before placing it securely inside his jacket. His expression remained calm, exactly as it had been from the first moment the patrol lights appeared behind his sedan. Officer Melissa Grant looked from Ryan to Elijah before speaking softly. Your Honor, I appreciate the professionalism you showed throughout this entire encounter. Elijah smiled gently. Professionalism should never depend on who someone turns out to be, he replied. It should begin with the very first conversation. Those words settled quietly over the roadside. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly before looking back toward Elijah. He understood that the statement was not criticism. It was a reminder of the responsibility carried by every person entrusted with public authority. Elijah continued in the same measured voice. If I had introduced myself by my title the moment you approached my window, this morning would have taught us very little. Every citizen deserves respect, before anyone knows their profession, their position, or their influence. Justice loses part of its meaning the moment it depends on recognition instead of fairness. Neither officer interrupted. They simply listened. The breeze moved gently through the trees lining the boulevard, while sunlight reflected across the polished hood of the gray sedan. Imagine a world where dignity is offered only after someone proves they are important. Then imagine a world where dignity is offered first, simply because every human being deserves it. The difference between those two worlds begins with ordinary moments exactly like this one. Ryan took a slow breath before speaking again. I will remember what happened here today. Elijah nodded. That is all anyone can ask. Every day offers another opportunity to become better than the day before. Melissa quietly returned to her patrol vehicle while Ryan stepped back from the driver's side door. You are free to continue your trip, sir, he said respectfully. Elijah opened the driver's door, paused briefly, and looked once more at both officers. The law protects its greatest purpose when it protects every person equally, he said. Titles come and go. Character remains. With that, he entered the sedan, started the engine, and carefully merged back into the steady morning traffic. The flashing patrol lights disappeared. The boulevard returned to its ordinary rhythm. Yet for Ryan Carter, the morning would never again feel ordinary. Long after the gray sedan vanished beyond the next intersection, one truth remained clearer than ever. Authority may command attention, but only fairness earns trust. And the strongest foundation of justice is not found inside a courtroom or written in law books. It begins with the simple choice to see every person with equal dignity before making any judgment at all. News of the roadside encounter traveled much farther than anyone expected, not because of dramatic headlines or sensational rumors, but because the quiet professionalism displayed afterward became a point of discussion inside both the courthouse and the police department. By the following morning, the official body camera recording had been reviewed through normal administrative procedures. Supervisors noted that every instruction had been documented, every response had been recorded, and every moment of the encounter revealed something more valuable than a routine traffic stop. It revealed how easily first impressions could shape decisions before facts had the opportunity to speak. Inside the Birmingham Police Department, Officer Ryan Carter sat alone in a small conference room, reviewing the recording from beginning to end. He watched himself approach the gray sedan. He listened to every question he had asked. He observed Elijah Brooks answering each one with patience, courtesy, and complete cooperation. The video contained no raised voices, no confrontation, and no resistance. Yet as Ryan replayed the recording, he noticed something he had completely missed while standing on the roadside. Elijah had treated him with respect from the very first word to the very last, even during the moments when it would have been easy to become frustrated. That realization stayed with him long after the video ended. Across town, Elijah arrived at the courthouse precisely on schedule. Staff members greeted him respectfully as he entered the historic marble building, but nothing about his routine changed. He reviewed case files, met briefly with fellow justices, and prepared for another day dedicated to interpreting the law with fairness and impartiality. Not once did he mention the traffic stop unless someone asked directly. When one judicial clerk quietly remarked that many people would have revealed their title immediately, Elijah smiled gently before answering. A title should never be the first thing that earns someone respect. If it is, then we have misunderstood the purpose of justice. Those words quietly spread throughout the courthouse, repeated not because they were dramatic, but because they reflected a principle larger than any single person. Imagine how different every public encounter would become if people were treated with equal dignity before anyone knew their profession, income, influence, or position. That simple idea stayed with everyone who heard the story. Later that afternoon, Ryan requested a brief meeting with his supervising lieutenant. It was not required. No one had ordered it. He simply believed it was the right thing to do. During the conversation, he spoke honestly about the assumptions he had carried into the traffic stop and the lesson he had taken away from it. His supervisor listened carefully before responding. Experience teaches procedures, the lieutenant said. Character teaches judgment. Never stop developing both. Ryan left the office carrying those words with him. They were not a punishment. They were an opportunity. Meanwhile, Elijah stood beside the large courthouse windows overlooking downtown Birmingham as the afternoon sunlight reflected across the city streets below. Thousands of people moved through their ordinary lives, each carrying responsibilities, hopes, and unseen stories. He understood that justice was never built through extraordinary moments alone. It was built through countless ordinary decisions made with fairness, humility, and respect. The encounter on the roadside had ended, but its lesson continued to travel quietly from one person to another, proving that the most meaningful victories are often measured not by who held the greatest authority, but by who chose to use it with the greatest integrity. Several weeks passed, and the quiet lesson from that morning continued to influence people far beyond the roadside where it had begun. At the Birmingham Police Department, Officer Ryan Carter approached every traffic stop differently. The procedures remained the same, but his perspective had changed. Before asking a question, he reminded himself that every driver carried a story he could not see. Before reaching a conclusion, he allowed facts to arrive first. Fellow officers gradually noticed the difference. Conversations during training sessions became more thoughtful. New recruits listened as experienced supervisors emphasized that professionalism was measured not only by enforcing the law, but by demonstrating fairness from the very first interaction. The body camera recording was occasionally referenced during internal discussions, not as an example of public embarrassment, but as a reminder that character is revealed most clearly in ordinary moments. Officer Melissa Grant also carried the experience with her. She often reflected on the quiet confidence Elijah Brooks had displayed without ever relying on his title. During one community outreach event, a young student asked her what the most important quality of a police officer should be. Melissa smiled before answering, respect. Because once people know they are respected, everything else becomes easier to build. Across the city, Elijah Brooks continued serving on the nation's highest court with the same humility that had defined every step of his career. His schedule remained filled with hearings, legal discussions, and long hours reviewing constitutional questions that affected millions of Americans. Yet despite the enormous responsibility resting on his shoulders, he never allowed the position to separate him from the people the justice system was created to serve. On one quiet afternoon, while speaking to a group of law students visiting the courthouse, Elijah shared a simple observation without mentioning the roadside encounter directly. Every decision begins long before a judge enters a courtroom, he said. It begins with the way we choose to see another person. If respect is absent at the beginning, fairness becomes much harder to reach at the end. The students listened carefully, writing down every word. Some would become attorneys. Others would become judges, prosecutors, or public defenders. Each carried away the same message. Imagine how many lives can be influenced by a single respectful conversation. Imagine how many misunderstandings can be prevented when assumptions are replaced with patience. Those questions quietly remained with everyone who heard Elijah speak. Months later, Ryan happened to see Elijah again while attending a public ceremony honoring civic leadership. Their eyes met across the reception hall, and Ryan approached with genuine appreciation. "Your Honor," he said warmly, "I wanted to thank you again for the lesson you gave me that morning." Elijah smiled with the same quiet kindness Ryan remembered from the roadside. "You learned it because you were willing to learn," he replied. "That is what matters most." They shook hands briefly before continuing in different directions, each returning to the responsibilities that defined their professions. Neither man viewed the encounter as a victory over the other. Instead, both understood it as a reminder that justice grows stronger whenever humility and integrity guide the choices of ordinary people. The story that had begun beneath flashing patrol lights was never truly about status or authority. It became a lasting example that fairness is not reserved for courtrooms, government offices, or official ceremonies. It begins in everyday conversations, in simple acts of respect, and in the quiet decision to recognize another person's humanity before making any judgment at all. The seasons continued to change, but the memory of that quiet morning never disappeared from the people whose lives had briefly crossed along the side of a Birmingham roadway. The traffic stop was never remembered because someone important had been recognized. It was remembered because it revealed something far more valuable. It reminded everyone involved that the true measure of justice is found in the moments before anyone knows who stands before them. On a clear autumn afternoon, Elijah Brooks stood once again at the entrance of the historic courthouse, watching citizens walk through the tall stone doors carrying hopes, concerns, and expectations that could never be measured by titles or appearances. Lawyers hurried toward hearings. Families waited patiently in the lobby. Young interns carried stacks of legal files with determined expressions. Every person entered the building with a different story, yet each deserved the same promise. Equal treatment beneath the law. That promise had guided Elijah throughout his entire career, and after the roadside encounter, its meaning felt even more personal. Across town, Officer Ryan Carter had quietly become known among newer officers as someone who never rushed to conclusions. During field training, he often reminded recruits that professionalism begins long before paperwork is completed or decisions are made. It begins with the very first greeting. It begins with the willingness to listen. It begins with remembering that every individual deserves respect before any judgment is formed. His words carried weight because they came from experience rather than theory. One afternoon, while speaking to a class of future law enforcement officers, Ryan paused before sharing the lesson that had changed his own perspective forever. "The badge gives us responsibility," he said. "It does not give us permission to assume we already know someone's story." The classroom remained completely silent. No dramatic example was necessary. The truth behind those words was powerful enough on its own. Imagine living in a society where every conversation begins with dignity instead of suspicion, where every public servant remembers that authority exists to protect people rather than define them. Imagine how many misunderstandings would disappear if patience always arrived before assumptions. Those questions remained long after the lecture ended because they challenged something much larger than a single roadside encounter. Months later, during a civic event celebrating public service, Elijah and Ryan crossed paths one final time. There were no cameras surrounding them, no reporters asking questions, and no audience waiting for an unforgettable speech. They simply exchanged a warm handshake and a quiet smile. Ryan thanked Elijah once again, and Elijah answered with the same humility that had defined every step of his journey. "Every day gives us another opportunity to choose fairness," he said. "That choice is what keeps justice alive." As evening settled over Birmingham and the courthouse lights gradually illuminated the city streets, ordinary people continued walking home, driving through intersections, and living lives that would never appear in headlines. Yet the lesson from that simple traffic stop continued, moving quietly from one person to another. It reminded judges, officers, attorneys, students, and citizens alike that respect should never depend on recognition, and dignity should never depend on status. Because in the end, the strongest law is not written only in constitutions or engraved above courthouse doors. It is written in the everyday decision to see another human being first, before seeing anything else. And that is where justice finds its truest beginning.